All I'm offering is the truth, nothing more.
This book is a big red pill. It explores sensitive topics that many leftists avoid. In Blackshirts and Reds, Parenti draws attention to how mainstream and left intellectuals have superimposed their liberal ideology in a way that equates fascism with communism. Chapters 1, 2, and 3 explore the material and class differences that distinguish fascism from communism. He demystifies revolutions from violence and calls out the fake synthetic woke left. Chapters 4, 5, 6, and 7, he lays out a critical analysis of the USSR, explores Soviet myths, including the gulags, and puts into context the devastation that took place after the fall of the Soviet Union. The last two chapters clarify Marxism, dialectical materialism, and class analysis, and what the left gets wrong. This book attempts to show the enormous differences between fascism and communism, both past and present, both in theory and practice, especially in regard to questions of social equality, private capital accumulation, and class interests. US leaders have dedicated above all to making the world safe for global corporate investment and the private profit system. Pursuant of this goal, they have used fascism to protect capitalism, while claiming to be saving democracy from communism. In 1992, following the fall of the Soviet Union, Francis Fukuyama published his book, The End of History. The United States was now the sole superpower in the world, ushering a brief age of unipolarity. For many, it was easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. Postmodernism became the cultural logic of late-stage capitalism. This is what Parenti calls the big lie. What we've been told about socialism and communism simply isn't true. And throughout this book, Parenti makes the argument that Marxism and class analysis is still relevant today, if not more relevant. Chapter 1 is Rational Fascism. Fascism was more than just an irrational ideology of hate or racism. History books, modern critics, and apologists of fascism lack a class analysis. How did they deal with social security, taxes, business, labor, who benefits, and at whose expense? Stuck in their liberal Anglo box, they overlooked the rational political economic functions that fascism performed, its class control function. In Marx's 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, Marx describes Bonapartism, or divisions within the ruling class. As the capitalist economic system approaches crisis, the ruling class becomes increasingly divided in how to deal with the crisis. This is the most important analysis in understanding the divisions between the two bourgeois parties today, the Democrats and the Republicans. Bonapartism can take a left and a right form. On the left, a good example is FDR, who offered class concessions to the public during a time of economic crisis. On the right, a good example is Hitler, who imposed class control onto the public. In the first section, plutocrats choose autocrats. In fascist Italy, Mussolini started out as a somewhat lazy or unprincipled socialist and opportunist. Following World War I, he became leader of a movement composed of the Blackshirts. The Blackshirts were ex-army officers with no ideology other than militaristic patriotism and conservative dislike. During the post-war economic recession, Mussolini imposed austerity and corporate welfarism to maintain profits for the ruling class. The large landowners and industrialists would have to slash wages and raise prices. The state in turn would have to provide them with massive subsidies and tax exemptions. To finance this corporate welfarism, the populace would have to be taxed more heavily. The social services and welfare expenditures would have to be drastically cut. He abolished democratic rights and imposed a stern order on the masses, smashing their unions, political organizations, and civil liberties. In 1922, he led the March on Rome, which was a coup that led to the repression of opposition newspapers and communist leaders, including Antonio Gramsci. A similar outcome occurred in Germany. Following World War I, the Weimar Republic established a social democracy. The ruling class saw their profits threatened, imposed austerity and state subsidies. On page 4, Parenti says, but to revive profit levels, heavy industry and big finance wanted wage cuts for the workers and massive state subsidies and tax cuts for themselves. The SA Stormtroopers, or Brown Shirts as they were called, were formed as a counter-gang, an anti-labor paramilitary force subsidized by big business. Marx describes counter-gangs in the 18th Brumaire as an alliance between the petty bourgeois and lumpen proletariat. Modern examples of counter-gang might include Antifa or Breadtube. During the 1920s Weimar Republic, the stormtroopers' function was to terrorize workers and farm laborers. Later on, the capitalists determined that the Weimar Republic no longer served their interests. Business tycoons supplied the Nazis with generous funds for fleets of motor cars and loudspeakers to saturate the cities and villages of Germany, along with funds for Nazi Party organizations, youth groups, and paramilitary forces. In 1919, Germany had a failed communist revolution known as the Spartacus Uprising. Following this event, the ruling party in Germany, the Social Democrats, had executed two prominent communist leaders, Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, on the same day. This led to communist leaders at the Sixth Comintern to label Social Democrats as social fascists for their betrayal of the communists. This brings us to a key election in November 1932. Social Democrat leaders refused the Communist Party's proposal to form an 11th-hour coalition against Nazism. Social Democrats would rather ally themselves with the reactionary right than make common cause with the Reds. In 1933, Social Democrat President Hindenburg invited Hitler to become chancellor, and the rest is history.
In order to ensure the security and continuing stability, the Republic will be reorganized into the first galactic empire for a safe and secure society.
This is how liberty dies, with thunderous applause.
Upon assuming state power, they crushed organized labor and eradicated all elections, opposition parties, and independent publications. Hundreds of thousands of opponents were imprisoned, tortured, or murdered. In Germany, as in Italy, the communists endured the severest political repression of all groups. Both fascist Italy and Germany ended up with the same repressive solutions: similar economic power and class conflict. Fascism emerged to do its utmost to save big capital from the impositions of democracy. Fascism, a form of Bonapartism, is a 1-2 punch. In Germany, following the failed revolution of 1919, we saw the first punch, left-wing or social fascism, class concession. When that failed, we saw the second punch, right-wing fascism, class control. Whom did the fascists support? In the name of saving society from the Red Menace, unions and strikes were outlawed. Union property and farm cooperatives were confiscated and handed over to the rich private owners. Minimum wage laws, overtime pay, and factory safety regulations were abolished. Speed-ups became commonplace. Dismissals or imprisonment awaited those workers who complained about unsafe or inhumane work conditions. Workers toiled longer hours for less pay. The already modest wages were severely cut. In Italy, child labor was reintroduced. To be sure, a few crumbs were thrown to the populace. There were free concerts and sporting events, some meager social programs, a dole for the unemployed, financed mostly by contributions from working people, and a showy public works project designed to evoke civic pride. This was bread and circus for the masses. Both fascist Italy and Germany showed their gratitude towards their big business patrons by privatizing many perfectly solvent state-owned steel mills, power plants, banks, and steamship companies. Both regimes dipped heavily into the public treasury to refloat or subsidize heavy industry. Agribusiness farming was expanded and heavily subsidized. Public capital was raided by private capital, and the tax burden was shifted from the rich to the poor. Taxes were increased for the general populace, but lowered or eliminated for the rich and big business. Inheritance taxes on the wealthy were greatly reduced or abolished altogether. The result of these economic programs in Italy was recession, a staggering public debt, and widespread corruption. But industrial profits and weapon supplies rose in preparation for the war to come. In Germany, unemployment was cut in half, with a considerable expansion of armament jobs. But overall poverty increased because of the drastic wage cuts. And from 1935 to 1943, industrial profits increased substantially, along with the income of corporate leaders. In comparison to Eastern social democracy, where the rich saw a modest decline, in Germany, the rich got richer. Parenti says fascism was an all-out government support for business and severe repression of anti-business pro-labor forces. The German bourgeoisie saw their class interests threatened by social democracy welfare programs of the Weimar Republic, strong enough to cut into profit rates and interfere with the capital accumulation process. This frustrated capitalism's attempt to resolve its internal contradictions by shifting more and more of its costs onto the backs of the working populace. There were a variety of U.S. Nazi sympathizers who engaged in secret deals with Germany. Ford helped rearm the Nazis following World War I and was a staunch supporter of the regime. IBM ran the punch card machine for the Holocaust. U.S. newspapers praised Mussolini for saving Italy from anarchy and radicalism. A.P. Gianni from Bank of America financed Italian press newspapers and printed stories favorable of fascism. William Randolph Hearst, in exchange for more positive coverage of the Hearst newspaper, Nazis paid almost 10 times the standard subscription rate for Hearst's INS wire service, and actually let some Nazis write stories. In 1933, there was actually a fascist coup in America called the Business Plot. Business leaders, including Prescott Bush, planned the overthrow of FDR, later exposed by Smedley Butler.
I appeared before the Congressional Committee, the highest representation of the American people, under subpoena to tell what I knew of activities which I believe might lead to an attempt to set up a fascist dictatorship. The plan as outlined to me was to form an organization of veterans, to use as a bluff or as a club at least, to intimidate the government and break down our democratic institutions.
Because of imperialist competition, the United States became increasingly involved in World War II. Italy and Germany, allied with Japan, another industrial latecomer, were aggressively seeking a share of the world's market and colonial booty, an expansionism that brought them increasingly into conflict with more established Western capitalist nations like Great Britain, France, and the United States. The rational use of irrational ideology. Many bourgeois scholars and historians overlook the rational political economic functions that fascism performed, its class control function. Much of politics is the rational manipulation of irrational symbols. In fascist society, there was a cult of the leader and idolatry of the state. They were against individualism and pro-war. On page 12, Parenti attempts to define fascism. Fascist doctrine stresses monistic values. Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer, one people, one rule, one leader. The people are no longer concerned with class divisions, but must see themselves as a harmonious whole, rich and poor as one, a view that supports the economic status quo by cloaking the ongoing system of class exploitation. This is in contrast to a left agenda that advocates the articulation of popular demands and a sharpened awareness of social injustice and class struggle. In fascist Italy and Germany, there was an appeal to mysticism and a return to the mythical roots. In Italy, this was ancient Rome. For Hitler, this was Volk, or race. Fascism's national chauvinism, racism, sexism, and patriarchal values also served a conservative class interest. Genetics and biology are marshaled to justify the existing class structure. One can recall the Bell Curve book, written by Charles Murray, which justifies an IQ distribution among the population, a narrative propagated by the intellectual dark web, including Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris. There were gay Nazis, for example, Ernst Röhm, an SA leader. At first, Hitler defended the gays because the SA stormtroopers were on his side, but later the SA stormtroopers grew to 3 million. The SA was dangerous as they denounced bourgeois decadence and advocated for a second revolution. Hitler used the SA to take power, then used the state to neutralize the SA. Fascists used fear as a weapon. Racism served to misdirect frustrations towards convenient scapegoats tailored to specific audiences. For German super patriots, the Jew was an alien internationalist. For the unemployed, the Jew was a capitalist banker. For the debtor farmer, the Jew was a usurer. And for the middle class, the Jews were union leaders and communists. The fascists stole many ideas from communists. They stole the left's thunder. There were mass mobilizations, youth organizations, work brigades, rallies, parades, banners, symbols, and slogans. The SA stormtroopers advocated a second revolution. They stole their name, National Socialists. They wore red armbands, which the communists wore first. Mainstream writers feel free to treat fascism and communism as totalitarian twins. It is a case of reducing essence to form. The similarity in form is taken as reason enough to blur the vast differences in actual class content. Countless Western Western political leaders regularly lump fascism with communism. Thus, Noam Chomsky claims the rise of corporations was in fact a manifestation of the same phenomena that led to fascism and Bolshevism, which sprang out of the same totalitarian soil. Fascism never intended to offer a social solution that would serve the general populace, only a reactionary one, forcing all the burdens and losses onto the working public. Fascism is nothing more than a final solution to the class struggle, the totalistic submergence and exploitation of democratic forces for the benefit and profit of higher financial circles. Fascism propagates a new order while serving the same old moneyed interests, friendly to fascism. Western capitalists saw Hitler as a bulwark against communism in Germany, and Nazi Germany as a bulwark against communism in Europe. Following U.S. entry into the war, U.S.-Nazi collaboration continued. The Rockefeller family's Chase National Bank used its Paris office in Vichy, France, to help launder German money to facilitate Nazi international trade during the war. Corporations like DuPont, Ford, General Motors, and ITT owned factories in enemy countries. Pilots were given instruction not to hit factories in Germany that were owned by U.S. firms. After World War II, the Western Allies did little to eradicate fascism from Italy or Germany, except for putting some of the top leaders on trial at Nuremberg. Hundreds of Nazi war criminals found a haven in the United States, either living in comfortable anonymity or actively employed by U.S. intelligence agencies during the Cold War. For example, Operation Paperclip was a secret U.S. intelligence program in which more than 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians were taken away from former Nazi Germany to the United States for government employment after the end of World War II. Under the protection of U.S. occupation authorities, the police, courts, military, security agencies, bureaucracy remained largely staffed by those who served the former fascist regimes. Chapter 2. Let us now praise revolution. Parenti starts with the costs of counter-revolution. On page 24, he says, "We are told that U.S. forces must intervene in this or that country in order to protect U.S. interests, thwart aggression, and defend our national security. The public was told that the peoples of various countries were in need of our civilizing guidance, coups and killings in order to uplift lesser peoples." Regarding the rise of the USSR and Communist China, the communists were depicted as evil incarnate, demonized conspirators who sought power for power's sake. The United States had to be everywhere to counteract this spreading cancer, we were told. In Vietnam, they dropped many times more tons of explosives than were used throughout World War II by all combatants combined, and killed some 40,000 people in the Phoenix program. The death toll of capitalism by direct military action is incalculable. U.S. forces or U.S.-supported surrogate forces slaughtered 2 million North Koreans in a 3-year war, 3 million Vietnamese, over 500,000 in aerial wars over Laos and Cambodia, 1.5 million in Angola, 1 million in Mozambique, over 500,000 in Afghanistan, half to 1 million in Indonesia, 200,000 in East Timor, 100,000 in both Nicaragua and Guatemala, over 700,000 in Iraq, 60,000 in El Salvador, 30,000 in the dirty wars of Argentina, 35,000 in Taiwan, and 20,000 in Chile. The 1991 war waged by the Bush administration against Iraq, which claimed an estimated 200,000 victims, was followed by U.S.-led United Nations economic sanctions, which led to the death of over 500,000 babies due to unsafe water. Sanctions kill. The United States saw a wave of anti-communist propaganda, with cries of the tyranny of the Red Menace. But the anti-communist opinion makers never spelled out what communists actually did in the way of socio-economic policy. Their efforts advanced the living standards and life chances of hundreds of millions in countries that had long suffered under the yoke of feudal oppression and Western colonial pillage. An improvement in mass well-being never before witnessed in history. The real sin of revolutionaries, communists or not, was that they championed the laboring classes against the wealthy few. They advocated changes in the distribution of class power and the way wealth was produced and used. They wanted less individualistic advancement at the expense of the many and collective betterment for the entire working populace. The ruling classes hate and fear communism not for its lack of political democracy, but because it attempts to establish economic democracy by building an egalitarian collectivist social system. The United States had many many excuses for intervention. First, it was to limit economic development. Second, it was containment in order to protect our national interests. This was true only if we equate our national interests with the investment interests of high finance, with imperialism. But these corporate interests do not represent the interests of the US people. The public pays for the huge military budgets and endures the export of its jobs to foreign labor markets, the inflow of thousands of impoverished immigrants who compete for scarce employment and housing. Countries with an alternative socialist system, one that uses land, labor, capital, and natural resources in collectivist ways, placing people before profits, would eventually undermine global capitalism. The third excuse was the US has a moral obligation to guarantee stability in developing nations threatened by revolutions and terrorists. In fact, many of these oligarchs are trained and financed by US or CIA, for example, the School of Americas in Latin America. The fourth excuse is that social change should be peacefully pursued over revolutionary turmoil. The US says they are not opposed to social revolution, but to its violent methods. US says change should happen gradually and peacefully, preferably through private investment and the benign workings of the free market. In fact, corporate investment is more likely to deter rather than encourage reform by preempting markets and restructuring the local economy to fit foreign capital extraction needs. International finance capital has no interest in bettering the life chances of the third world peoples.
So one of the laws of capitalist motion and development is this inexorable expansion. And that means expansion into an expropriation of the third world. A process that's been going on for about 400 years. Perpetrated by the Portuguese, the Spaniards, the Dutch, the Belgians, the French, the English, and most recently, most successfully, most impressively, by the Americans. That is by the ruling classes of these countries, not by the ordinary people. The ordinary people simply paid the costs of empire. The ordinary people simply sent their sons off to die. But that expropriation of the third world has been going on for 400 years, brings us to another revelation. Namely, that the third world is not poor. You don't go to poor countries to make money. There are very few poor countries in this world. Most countries are rich. The Philippines are rich. Brazil is rich. Mexico is rich. Chile is rich. Only the people are poor. But there's billions to be made there, to be carved out and to be taken. There's been billions for 400 years. The capitalist European and North American powers have carved out and taken the timber, the flax, the hemp, the cocoa, the rum, the tin, the copper, the iron, the rubber, the bauxite, the slaves, and the cheap labor. They have taken out of these countries. These countries are not underdeveloped. They're overexploited.
The next section is on violence. People throughout the world do not need more corporate investments. Rather, they need the opportunity to respect their land, labor, natural resources, and markets in order to serve their own social needs. Such a revolutionary development invites fierce opposition from apostles of the free market, whose violent resistance to social change makes peaceful transformation impossible to contemplate. U.S. reforms of limited scope have been achieved without revolution, but with a considerable amount of violence and bloodshed, mostly by police and security forces. In contrast to revolutionary violence, most of the violence comes from those who attempt to prevent reform, not from those struggling for reform. By focusing on the violent rebellions of the downtrodden, we overlook the much greater and repressive force and violence utilized by the ruling oligarchs to maintain their status quo.
Those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable.
Most social revolutions begin peacefully. Revolutions in Russia, China, and Vietnam all began peacefully, with crowds of peasants and workers launching nonviolent protests, only to be met with violent oppression from the authorities. The dissidents who continue to fight back, who try to defend themselves from the oligarchs' repressive fury, are then called violent revolutionaries, or terrorists. This is a form of Orwellian doublespeak. When revolutionaries fight imperialism, they're called terrorists. When revolutionaries serve imperialism, they're called freedom fighters. The next section, free market for the few. On page 31, Parenti says, what poses as a U.S. commitment to peaceful, nonviolent change is really a commitment to the violent defense of an unjust, undemocratic global capitalism. The U.S. national security state uses coercion and violence not in support of social reform but against it, all in the name of stability, counterterrorism, democracy, and today, the free market. Parenti quotes a U.S. diplomat during the Cold War who said, it is better to have a strong repressive regime in power than a liberal government. The U.S. has a long history of supporting repressive regimes. Pinochet in Chile, Park Chung-hee in South Korea, Batista in Cuba, South African apartheid, and today the U.S. provides military and financial support to Saudi Arabia and Israel. The U.S. policymaking establishment has been concerned not with advancing the welfare of impoverished peoples around the world, but with defeating whoever allies themselves with the common people, be the Reds or not. U.S. leaders claim to be offended by certain features of social revolutionary governments, such as one-party rule and the coercive implementation of revolutionary change. But one-party autocracy is acceptable if the government is rightist, that is, friendly towards private corporate investment such as Turkey, Zaire, Guatemala, Indonesia, even friendly towards China following Deng's market reforms and opening up. But today this is changing. Contrary to popular belief, most actually existing socialist and anti-imperialist nations such as China, Russia, or Syria are more democratic than the US. Anyone who utters a good word about leftist one-party revolutions is labeled a Stalinist or a tanky. In reality, there's no such thing as Stalinists. They're just Marxist-Leninists. And tanky is a pejorative term that's been used to associate communists with the dehumanizing Western propaganda of the Soviet Union. Every news story coming out of the US media would show a line of scary tanks. In the section Freedom of Revolution, on page 35, Parenti says there is no such thing as freedom in the abstract. Revolutionary governments extend a number of popular freedoms without destroying those freedoms that never existed in previous regimes. Consider Tsarist Russia before the Soviet Union was formed. Consider the vastly improved conditions of women in revolutionary Afghanistan and South Yemen before the counter-revolutionary repression in the 1990s, or in Cuba after the 1959 revolution as compared to before, when the country was ruled by a US-backed dictator Batista. The Chinese Revolution did not crush democracy because there was none to crush in that oppressively feudal regime. The Cuban Revolution did not destroy freedom. It destroyed a hateful US-sponsored police state. The Vietnamese revolutionaries did not abrogate individual rights. No such rights were available under the US-supported puppet governments. Of course, revolutions do limit the freedoms of the corporate property class and other privileged interests. The freedom to invest privately without regard to human or environmental costs. Parenti asks, have we compared the violence of revolution against the violence that preceded it? We always hear the statistics of 100 million killed by Stalin or Mao, quoted from the debunked Black Book and literal Nazi propaganda. But we never hear of the countless lives destroyed by imperialism. Their sufferings go unrecorded. No one is tallying the thousands of nameless victims who succumbed to US-trained torturers in Latin America, the hundreds of villages burned by counterinsurgency forces. In Cuba, how does the victimization in pre-revolutionary Cuba measure against the much more widely publicized repression that came after the revolution? In the US-supported right-wing Batista dictatorship, the rural population lived in makeshift shacks without minimal sanitation. Malnourished children went barefoot in the dirt and suffered the familiar plague of parasites common to the third world. There were almost no doctors or schools, and throughout much of the year, families that depended solely on the seasonal sugar harvest lived close to starvation. Castro executed a few hundred of the previous regime's police assassins and torturers, drove assorted upper-class moneybags into exile, and intimidated opponents of radical reforms into silence. For all these mistakes and abuses, the Cuban Revolution brought sanitation, schools, health clinics, jobs, housing, and human services to a level not found in most of the third world and in many parts of the first world. Infant mortality, life expectancy, and diseases have been wiped out by improved living standards and public health programs. Cuba has enjoyed a level of literacy higher than the United States and a life expectancy above age 75. Additionally, Cuba is known internationally for the humanitarian aid in the developing world, especially during crisis. They've sent teachers, doctors, and workers to dozens of third world countries without charging a penny. Cuba's real sin wasn't its lack of democracy, but the fact that it tried to develop an alternative to the global capitalist system, an egalitarian socio-economic order that placed corporate property under public ownership, abolished capitalist investment as a class entity, and put people before profits, and national independence before IMF servitude. The freedom that US policymakers care about is the freedom to utilize vast sums of money to accumulate still vaster sums, regardless of the human and environmental costs. Mass productivity coupled with elitist distribution results in more wealth for the few and greater poverty for the many. So after 2 centuries of incredible technological development and unprecedented economic expansion, the number of people living in poverty in the capitalist world has grown more quickly than any other demographic cohort. Just look at capitalist nations such as Guatemala, Nigeria, Honduras. This is why we need a government of action that will build the Sandino-Zapata economic corridor, that will reverse the economic disaster of neoliberalism in Latin America. Chapter 3 is left anti-communism. No matter what communists did, Cold War propaganda would make them look bad. If the churches in the USSR were empty, this demonstrated that religion was suppressed. But if the churches were full, this meant that the people were rejecting the regime's atheistic ideology. If the workers went on strike, as happened on infrequent occasions, this was evidence of their alienation from the collectivist system. If they didn't go on strike, this was because they were intimidated and lacked freedom. In this chapter, Parenti calls out the synthetic left, or what he later calls ABC theorists, anything but class. This tendency was articulated in Lenin's book Left-Wing Communism, an Infantile Disorder. Parenti takes aim at Noam Chomsky, who would be equivalent to today's Vosh or BreadTube. He says they engage in Soviet bashing and red baiting. They equate Marxism-Leninists to fascists, labeling them as Red Fash, Red-Brown Alliance, or Nazbols. More concerning is that this synthetic left tendency justifies violence against fascists and therefore advocate violence against Marxist-Leninists or tankies. USSR communists struggled in the face of a momentous onslaught to keep Soviet socialism alive for more than 70 years, many meeting their deaths after Yeltsin's violent repression of the Russian parliament in 1993. And let's not forget the tremendous sacrifice of the Russian and Chinese people during World War II. Parenti says, some leftists and others fall back on the old stereotype of power-hungry Reds who pursue power for power's sake, without regard for actual social goals. If true, one wonders why these Reds side with the poor and powerless, often at greater risk and sacrifice to themselves, rather than reaping the rewards that come with serving the well-placed. The synthetic left, such as Noam Chomsky, felt obliged to establish their credibility by indulging in anti-communist and anti-Soviet genuflection. The intent was to distance themselves from Marxist-Leninists, or tankies. During McCarthyism, organizations began purging the left of communists, with the logic that to save themselves from anti-communist witch hunts, we should ourselves become the witch hunters. For example, many communists were purged from academics, unions, law firms, even Hollywood. The Democratic Party would even purge progressives or social democrats. Those who fight for social change on behalf of the less privileged elements of society will be red-baited by conservative elites whether they were communists or not. A prototypic red basher who pretended to be on the left was George Orwell. In the middle of World War II, as the Soviet Union was fighting for its life against the Nazi invaders in Stalingrad, Orwell announced that a willingness to criticize Russia and Stalin is the best test of intellectual honesty. He would go on to write several books mischaracterizing communism and the Soviet Union. Sorely lacking within the US left is a rational evaluation of the Soviet Union, a nation that endured a protracted civil war and a multinational foreign invasion of 15 countries in the first years of its existence, and that 2 decades later threw back and destroyed the Nazi beast at enormous cost to itself. In the 3 decades after the Bolshevik Revolution, the Soviets made industrial advances equal to what capitalism took a century to accomplish, while feeding and schooling their children rather than working them 14 hours a day. The USSR went from a backwards agrarian feudal society to the space age in less than 50 years. The next section is slinging labels. Anyone who recognizes the achievements of actually existing socialist or anti-imperialist nations is labeled a Stalinist, tanky, or even a Nazbol. Our real sin was that, unlike many on the left, we refused to uncritically swallow US media propaganda about communist societies. For example, Chomsky, who maintained that the Bolsheviks are power-hungry intellectuals, villains seeking not revolutionary means to fight injustice, but power for power's sake.
The Leninist system was one of the greatest blows that socialism suffered in the 20th century.
Some of the best and brightest on the left sound not much better than the worst on the right. Lenin is often taken out of context with his statement, "The purpose of terror is to terrorize." In fact, his statement was disapproving of terrorism. Lenin polemicized against isolated terrorist attacks, which do nothing but create terror among the populace, invite repression, and isolate the revolutionary movement from the masses. Lenin didn't advocate violence and was a harsh critic of left adventurism, such as today's Antifa or the SDS of the 60s.
So we thundered out of the park about 10 or 12 abreast, and we headed down this way. And the first building we came to was a bank, and we trashed every window in the bank.
Fred, where does the Black Panther Party stand concerning the Weathermen, the SDS?
We stand way back from the SDS and the Weathermen. We think it is anarchistic, opportunistic, individualistic, it's chauvinistic, it's custoristic, and that's the bad part about it. It's custoristic in that its leaders take people into situations where the people can be massacred, and they call that revolution. And it's nothing but child's play, it's folly, and it's criminal because people can be hurt. We think these people may be sincere, but they're misguided, they're muddleheads, and they're scatterbrains.
Lenin constantly dealt with the problem of avoiding the two extremes of liberal bourgeois opportunism and ultra-left adventurism. For more on the topic, read Lenin's Left-Wing Communism, an Infantile Disorder. The next section is titled Pure Socialism versus Siege Socialism. Western leftists say things like, real socialism never existed. They say that the communist states offered nothing more than bureaucratic, one-party, state capitalism, or some such thing. But in fact, they were much different.
I believe China is a state capitalism.
State capitalism. State capitalism. State capitalism. State capitalism constituted the Soviet Union. Both the Russians and the Chinese set up a state capitalism.
Well, what should we call it? State capitalism has always struck me as a good phrase.
Perks enjoyed by party and government elites were modest by corporate CEO standards in the West. In communist countries, productive forces were not organized for capital gain and private enrichment. Public ownership of the means production supplanted private ownership. Individuals could not hire people and accumulate great personal wealth from their labor. For example, the income spread in the USSR was about 5 to 1, compared to the United States, which is about 10,000 to 1. Priority was placed on human services, guaranteed education, employment, housing, and medical assistance. And the USSR was not imperialist. Communist countries did not pursue the capital penetration of other countries. Lacking a profit motive as their motor force, and therefore having no need to constantly find new investment opportunities, they did not expropriate the lands, labor, markets, and natural resources of weaker nations. They engaged with other countries from the standpoint of mutual benefit. The Soviet Union, and now China, conducted trade and aid relations on terms that were generally favorable to both countries. Western leftists believe socialism is when you get together with your friends and build a co-op to run a factory. Pencil factory socialism is not socialism. They believe that real socialism would be controlled by the workers themselves through direct participation. These ideas are promoted by academics such as Richard Wolff, with his WSDEs, or Worker Self-Directed Enterprises, or anarchist Michael Elbert's Paracon. Unfortunately, this pure socialism view is ahistorical and non-falsifiable. It cannot be tested against the actualities of history. It compares an ideal against an imperfect reality, a state under siege by imperialism. It is also utopian. It imagines what socialism would be in a world far better than this one, where no strong state structure or security force is required, where none of the value produced by workers needs to be expropriated to rebuild society and defend it from invasion and internal sabotage or counter-revolution. These pure socialists do not explain how the manifold functions of a revolutionary society would be organized, how external attack and internal sabotage would be thwarted, how bureaucracy would be avoided, scarce resources allocated, policy differences settled, priorities set, and production and distribution conducted. Instead, they offer vague statements about how the workers themselves will directly own and control the means of production and will arrive at their own solutions through creative struggle. No surprise then that the pure socialists support every revolution except the ones that succeed. Synthetic leftists blame existing socialists for every defeat rather than global concentration of capital that is destroying all independent economies and putting an end to national sovereignty everywhere. Centralization of power was a necessary choice in securing and protecting socialist relations. Stalin, Mao, Castro, Ho Chi Minh, and the millions of heroic people who followed and fought with them, these leaders weren't in a vacuum. They were in a whirlwind. To blame this or that theory is a simple-minded substitute for the kind of analysis that Marxists should make. For example, in Nicaragua, after the Sandinistas overthrew the US-backed Somoza dictatorship, ultra-leftists called for direct worker ownership of the factories. While undeniably appealing, this worker syndicalism denies the necessities of state power. Under such an arrangement, the FSLN Nicaraguan revolution would not have lasted 2 months against the US-sponsored counter-revolutionary Contras that savaged the country afterwards. The next section is decentralization versus survival. Parenti says, for a revolution to survive, it must seize state power and use it to A. break through the stranglehold exercised by the owning class over society's institutions and resources, and B. withstand the reactionary counterattack that is sure to come. The internal and external dangers a revolution faces necessitate a centralized state that is not particularly to anyone's liking. Anarchism, he says, is the absence of government, the direct administration by people of their own lives. Who could not want that? Anarchists don't say how it would work except to assert that anarchists want it right now, in all the confusion and disorder of right now. They say that anarchism is still intact as an idea, for it has never been tried. This is exactly the problem. Why in so many hundreds of rebellions, anarchism has never succeeded in surviving. Decentralized parochiral autonomy is the graveyard of insurgency, which may be one reason why there has never been a successful anarcho-syndicalist revolution. Ideally, it would be a fine thing to have only local, self-directed worker participation with minimal bureaucracy, police, and military. This probably would be the development of socialism, where socialism were ever allowed to develop unhindered by counter-revolutionary subversion and attack. One might recall how 15 capitalist nations, including the US, invaded Soviet Russia in a bloody and unsuccessful attempt to overthrow the revolutionary Bolshevik government. The years of foreign invasion and civil war did much to intensify the Bolsheviks' siege psychology, with its commitment to lockstep party unity and a repressive security apparatus. Lenin was forced to use democratic centralism to put an end to the opposition. Parenti says that the existence of civil war and war communism profoundly altered both the party and the emerging political system. By the late 1920s, the Soviets faced the choice of A. moving to a still more centralized direction with a command economy and forced agrarian collectivization and full-speed industrialization under a commandist, autocratic party leadership. This was the position advocated by Stalin. Or B. moving in a liberalized, decentralized direction with less effort given to the kind of capital accumulation needed to build a strong military-industrial base required to survive and defeat the Nazis. Option B would have risked being incapable of withstanding the Nazi onslaught, so the Soviet Union embarked upon a rigorous forced industrialization. It consisted mostly of building, within a decade, an entirely new, huge industrial base, the biggest steel complex in Europe, in anticipation of an invasion from the West. Stalin's prophecy that the USSR had only 10 years to do what the British had done in a century proved correct. When the Nazis invaded in 1941, that same industrial base, safely enclosed thousands of miles from the front, produced the weapons of war that eventually turned the tide. The cost of this survival included the 22 million Soviets who perished in the war and immeasurable devastation and suffering, the effects of which would distort Soviet society for decades afterwards. The fall or overthrow of the Soviet Union was cheered by many left intellectuals. In fact, the capitalist restoration in Eastern Europe weakened the numerous Third World liberation struggles that had received aid from the Soviet Union and brought a whole new crop of right-wing governments into existence. Governments in Africa collapsed, including Algeria, Mozambique, and Angola. Afghanistan was taken over by the Taliban, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Yugoslavia, Albania, Nicaragua, restoration of feudal monarchy in Cambodia, and Vietnam was forced to implement Doi Moi reforms. Overthrow of communism gave the green light to the unbridled exploitative impulses of Western corporate interests, no longer needing to compete or convince workers that they live better than their counterparts in Russia, and no longer restrained by a competing system. The corporate class is rolling back the many gains that working people in the West have won over the years. In Naomi Klein's Shock Doctrine, on page 316, she describes class concession. When the Cold War was in full swing and the Soviet Union was intact, the people of the world could choose, at least theoretically, which ideology they wanted to consume. There were the two poles, and there was much in between. That meant that capitalism had to win customers. It needed to offer incentives. It needed a good product. Keynesianism was always an expression of that need for capitalism to compete. With the USSR gone, there was no longer a check on US imperialism. The US immediately invaded Panama, Iraq, and other countries. Chapter 4 is Communism in Wonderland. In this chapter, Parenti outlines a critical analysis of the USSR's problems. The USSR rewarded inefficiency. On page 59 he says, central planning was useful and even necessary in the earlier period of siege socialism to produce steel and tanks in order to build an industrial base and withstand the Nazi onslaught. But it eventually hindered technological development and growth, and proved incapable of supplying a wide enough range of consumer goods and services. During the era of stagnation, or the Brezhnev era, top-down planning stifled innovation throughout the system. Stagnation was evident in the failure of the Soviet industrial establishment to apply the innovations of the scientific technological revolution of the 1970s and 80s, including the use of computer technology. Parenti then goes on to list some disincentives for innovation. Incompetent managers were not replaced, managers received no rewards for taking risks, and maintained their positions regardless. Scarce resources since inputs were fixed by the central plan. Experimentation risked failing quotas. There was no incentive or reward to innovate, rather there was a malincentive to cut corners to get results. There was scarcity of replacement parts because planners artificially set low prices and therefore factories didn't make them. Producers didn't pay full price for raw materials and fuel and therefore used them inefficiently. Irregular shipments of goods led to hoarding, which in turn caused shortages. Producing more meant you were given higher quotas and therefore high-performing factories were punished because the more you produce, the higher your quotas would be. He continues, we have been taught that people living under communism suffer from totalitarian control of every aspect of life. But they complain less about overbearing control than about the absence of responsible control. Maintenance people failed to perform needed repairs. Occupants of a new housing project might refuse to pay rent, and no one bothered to collect it. People complained about broken toilets, leaky roofs, rude salesmen, poor quality foods, late trains, deficient hospital services, and corrupt and unresponsive bureaucrats. Corruption and favoritism were commonplace. There was the manager who regularly pilfered the till, the workers who filched foodstuffs and goods from state stores, or supplies from factories in order to service private homes for personal gain, the peasants who stripped parts from tractors to sell them on the black market, the director who accepted bribes to place people on the top of the waiting list to buy cars, and the farmers who hoarded livestock, which they sold to townspeople at a profit. All of this was hardly the behavior of people trembling under a totalitarian rule of terror. Poor work performance resulted in increased subsidies and decreased quotas. Restaurants providing poor service would in turn get less customers and therefore had more food left over at the end of the night to take home. Workers would sit on their phones, spend days painting a wall which should have taken a few hours, and workers left their job to go shopping. This poor work discipline contributed to the decreased productivity and thus increased the scarcity. If workers were fired, they were guaranteed another job by the Constitution. Therefore, workers were not afraid to lose their jobs, and managers feared losing their best workers. It was a workers' job market. The slackers and pilfers had a demoralizing effect on those who wanted to work. Full employment was achieved by padding the workforce with people who had relatively little to do. This added to labor scarcity, low productivity, lack of work discipline, and the failure to implement labor-saving technologies that could maximize production. Communists assumed people would do their fair share, but they didn't. They lived in a wonderland economy, where prices had no relation to their actual costs or value. Many expensive services were provided almost entirely free, such as education, medical care, and most recreational, sporting, and cultural events. Housing, fuel, transportation, utilities, and basic foods were heavily subsidized. Many people had money, but not much to buy with it. High-priced quality goods and luxury items were hard to come by. All this in turn affected work performance. Why work hard to earn more when there was not much to buy? Without rigorous price controls, there was hidden inflation, a large black market, and long shopping lines. Citizens were expected to play by the rules and not take advantage of the system. The brutal totalitarian regime was actually a giant trough from which many took whatever they could. Strong resentment concerning consumer scarcities, the endless shopping lines, the 10-year wait for a new car, waiting for an apartment, all these problems took their toll on the people's commitment. The next section is wanting it all. People took for granted what they had in the way of human services and entitlements, while hungering for the consumer goods dangling in their imaginations. With their needs satisfied, a rise in living standards, and the fact that people were treated better, their wants and expectations escalated, and people wanted more of the good things, material wants, bourgeois decadence. Immigrants left for their desire for greater affluence rather than the quest for political freedom. For example, in Cuba, the revolutionary accomplishments in education and medical care are something they took for granted. Generally, they are more concerned about their own personal future than about socialism. There was also a petty bourgeois teenage rebellion element at play. Frustrated teens said things like, "We're tired of the slogans. They were alright for our parents, but the revolution is history. One example is the National Bolshevik Party, formed after the fall of the Soviet Union. It consisted of edgy punk rock kids, mostly from the petty bourgeoisie, and was quickly banned by the new right-wing government. In summary, the USSR lacked the ideology and vision required to carry out and sustain socialism. They failed to course correct to address the technology revolution. In contrast, China has addressed many of the mistakes of the USSR with socialism with Chinese characteristics. Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening up was necessary to build the material abundance required for socialism. And Xi Jinping has re-emphasized Marxist ideology in China to maintain the rigorous socialist path to full modernization. There is a major difference between television in the United States and in the USSR. In the United States, viewers were immersed in an advertising culture, with billions spent on marketing and manipulating images. In contrast, USSR television was dull and boring, mostly news, but with absolutely no commercials. They had exaggerated reports on the economy, and the people didn't believe the reports on the poverty and repression in the capitalist world. Many intellectuals in communist nations were utterly starry-eyed about the capitalist world. These intellectuals maintained that the capitalist West, especially the United States, was a free market paradise of abundance and almost limitless opportunity. As a system of analysis mainly concerned with the existing capitalism, Marxism has relatively little to say about the development of socialist societies. Its critique of capitalism had no vibrancy or meaning for those who lived in a non-capitalist society. The next section is romanticizing capitalism. On page 72, he says, communist leaders had even less understanding of the capitalist system than of their own. In 1985, Gorbachev launched Glasnost, which opened media to Western penetration and ended up accelerating many of the problems. It was anticipated that state ownership would exist on equal terms with cooperatives, foreign investors, and domestic private entrepreneurs. In fact, the whole state economy was put at risk and eventually undermined. Workers believed that if their factories were closed down during the transition to free market, that the state would find them some other work. They thought they would have it both ways. Many who argued for privatization also expected the government to continue providing them with collective benefits and subsidies. Some people want to be capitalists for themselves, but expect socialism to keep serving them. With Glasnost, they increased the price of newspaper to have parity with the actual costs. Pro-capitalist publications complained that state socialism would no longer subsidize their denunciations of state socialism. They were being subjected to the same free market realities that they so enthusiastically advocated for everyone else. But the USSR citizens who emigrated to the US knew better. They complained about this country's poor social services, crime, harsh work conditions, lack of communitarian spirit, vulgar electoral campaigns, inferior education standards, and the astonishing ignorance that Americans had about history. They discovered that they could no longer leave their jobs during the day to go shopping, and their employers provided no company doctor when they fell ill on the job, that they were subject to severe reprimands when tardy, that they could not walk the streets and parks late at night without fear, or that they might not be able to afford medical services for their family or college tuition for their children, and that they had no guarantee of a job and might experience unemployment at any time. Modern surveys in Russia, people said times were better during the USSR, especially during the Stalin period. And today, there is a rising Stalin nostalgia in Russia. US was thought to be a free market paradise, against the inflated imagination, the glittering image of the West's cornucopia. In the USSR, there was a dialectic that determined itself. Modernization and uplift also created expectations that could not be fulfilled. Many expected to keep all the securities of socialism overlaid with capitalist consumerism. Siege socialism could not make this transition to consumer socialism because the state of siege was never lifted. The USSR's problems were exacerbated by unrelenting external attacks and threats from the Western powers. Communist nations suffered through wars, invasions, and an arms race that exhausted their productive capacities and retarded their development. Finally, with perestroika, they attempted to restructure the economy to improve performance, but failed, and socialism was used to subsidize and build an unforgiving capitalism. The next section is Stalin's fingers. There's a story that Winston Churchill tells about the time he asked Stalin how many people died during the famine. According to Churchill, Stalin raised both of his hands like this, a gesture that may have indicated his unwillingness to broach the subject. Because Stalin had 5 fingers on each hand, Churchill concluded that Stalin was confessing to 10 million murders. One might recall, when communists lose power, there's little violence. For example, the Velvet Revolution, named so because of its non-violent transition in power. Rather than acting as might US-supported rulers in US Salvador, Colombia, Zaire, or Indonesia with death squad terrorism and mass repression, the communists relinquish power without firing a shot. The relatively peaceful transition does not fit our image of unscrupulous totalitarians who stop at nothing to maintain power over captive populations. Why didn't the ruthless Reds act more ruthlessly? The next section is titled, How Many Victims?
In the Soviet Union, somewhere between 30 and 50 million people were killed, and in China, might have been up to 100 million.
We always hear the claim that Stalin or Mao killed 100 million people. This would have constituted an astonishing portion of the Soviet population. It would have made the gulags or prisons the USSR's largest enterprise. Stalin's purges sent people into exile to Central Asia or Siberia, not gulags, prisons, or labor camps. After the fall of the Soviet Union, their confidential archives became public, and it was discovered that the entire gulag population in 1939, the end of the purges, was 2 million. Compare that at the time to the US prison state of 5.3 million under correctional supervision. The gulags were prisons. They were not death camps like those the Nazis built. There was no systematic extermination of inmates, no gas chambers or crematoria to dispose millions of bodies. Most survived. According to archive records, 20 to 40% were released each year. 1 million were released during World War II. Archive records reveal over 50% of the gulag deaths were during World War II. Contrary to popular belief, most of those incarcerated in the gulag were not political prisoners. Most were actual criminals, serving time for murder, assault, theft, and other violations punishable in any society. Records indicate 800,000 executions, including both non-political crimes and political. Those who collaborated with imperialists during the invasion, White Guard army atrocities, and Nazi collaborators during World War II. Although still not justified, the magnitude of executions was not in the millions or tens of millions as we are told. The next section is, where did the gulags go? After the fall of the Soviet Union, we should have seen a mass release of prisoners, but that never happened. Anti-communist writers such as Solzhenitsyn and many US anti-communist liberals maintain that the gulags existed right down to the last days of communism. If so, where did they disappear to? After Stalin's death in 1953, more than half of the gulag inmates were freed. When the communist states were overthrown, where were the half-starved hordes pouring out of those internment camps with their tales of travail? What are the supposedly vast numbers of political prisoners said to exist in the other communist totalitarian police states of Eastern Europe? Why no evidence of their mass release after the fall of the USSR? If there were mass atrocities right down to the last days of communism, why did not the newly installed anti-communist regimes seize the opportunity to bring erstwhile communist rulers to justice? Why no Nuremberg-style public trials documenting widespread atrocities? The next section, memories of maldevelopment. Pre-revolutionary Russia and China were backwards third world countries with widespread poverty and almost non-existent capital formation. These countries had known little democracy in the days before communism. In fact, China was nicknamed the sick man of Asia, and in Russia, the people lived under the Tsarist autocracy. During the years of Stalin's reign, the Soviet nation made dramatic gains in literacy, industrial wages, healthcare, and women's rights. In Cuba, the people lived under a US-sponsored dictatorship. To say that socialism doesn't work is to overlook the fact that it did. Revolutionary communism created a life for the mass of the people that was far better than that wretched existence they had endured under feudal lords, military bosses, foreign colonizers, and Western capitalists. The end result was a dramatic improvement in living standards for the hundreds of millions of people on a scale never before or since witnessed in history. State socialism transformed desperately poor countries into modernized societies in which everyone had enough food, clothing, and shelter, where elderly people had secure pensions, and where all children and many adults went to school and no one was denied medical attention. Throughout its entire 73-year history of counter-revolutionary invasion, civil war, forced industrialization, Nazi conquests, Stalinist purges and deportations, Cold War and nuclear arms race, the Soviet Union did not know one day of peaceful development. In the attempt to maintain military parity with the United States, the Soviets took on crushing defense costs that seriously depleted their civilian economy. In addition, they faced monetary boycott, trade discrimination, and technological embargo from the West. The next two chapters explore the devastation after the fall of the Soviet Union. Left anti-communists celebrated the overthrow of the USSR as a win for democracy.
The collapse of the Soviet Union is in fact
Small victory for socialism, in my opinion.
However, the free market could not be introduced through democratic means, only by force. Post-Soviet presidents demanded their parliaments be suspended and be allowed to rule by presidential decree. They had democratization via suppression. They purged communists, suppressed leftist newspapers, banned workers from engaging in political activity. Gorbachev strong-armed debates within the Soviet Congress to force a vote 3 times to abolish the USSR. He literally sold out the USSR for Pizza Hut.
Это Горбачев.
Горбачев.
Это... За Горбачева!
За Горбачева! За Горбачева! За Горбачева!
Sometimes nothing brings people together like a nice hot pizza from Pizza Hut.
Contrary to popular belief, the USSR did not fall. It was overthrown in a coup. In 1991, there was a failed armed coup by Communist Party leaders. The opponents were private entrepreneurs and the investor class, who had a wealth about 20 times that of the average Soviet citizen. The real coup came in the aftermath, when Boris Yeltsin used the incident to exceed his constitutional powers and dismantle the Soviet Union itself, absorbing all of its powers into his own Russian Republic. In 1993, Yeltsin went further. He forcibly disbanded the Russian parliament and every other elected representative body in the country. He abolished Russia's constitutional court and launched an armed attack upon the parliamentary building, killing an estimated 2,000 resistors and demonstrators. Thousands more were jailed without charges or a trial, and hundreds of elected officials were placed under investigation. Yeltsin banned labor unions from all political activities, suppressed dozens of publications, exercised monopoly control over all broadcast media, and permanently outlawed 15 political parties. He unilaterally scrapped the Constitution and replaced it with an illegal one that gave the president nearly absolute power over policy while reducing the democratically elected parliament to virtual impotence. For those crimes, he was hailed as a defender of democracy by U.S. leaders and media. More important than democratic rule was free market reform, a code word for capitalist restoration.
How would it be if the United States were viewed by the rest of the world as interfering with the elections directly of other countries, and everybody knew it? What would it be like? What would it be like? What would it be like?
The US and CIA have a brutal history of orchestrating regime change against democratically elected leaders. Iran in 1953, Guatemala in 1954, Chile in 1973, Haiti in 1991, most recently Honduras in 2009, Bolivia in 2019 with Evo Morales, and Venezuela in 2019 with Maduro. CIA-financed strikes, demonstrations, economic pressure, and disruptions are used time after time. Some states were entirely obliterated. Obviously the USSR, East Germany was absorbed into the West, and South Yemen was crushed by the North. Yugoslavia was fragmented by force into a number of small conservative republics under the suzerainty of Western powers. With that dismemberment came a series of wars, repressions, and atrocities committed by all contending sides. For example, in one of the breakaway states, Croatia, the constitution relegated Serbs, Jews, Gypsies, and Muslims to second-class status. If you'd like to learn more about what happened in Yugoslavia, I recommend reading To Kill a Nation by Michael Parenti. Must we adore Václav Havel? He was a playwright who became the first president to take power in 1989 after the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia. A superior, elitist cogitator, what Plato would call a philosopher king, he was endowed with a sense of transcendental responsibility and archetypal wisdom. Presenting himself as a man of peace and stating that he would never sell arms to oppressive regimes, he sold weapons to the Philippines and the fascist regimes in Thailand and Pinochet in Chile. Havel joined the Gulf War that killed hundreds of thousands. He voted with the United States to condemn human rights violators in Cuba, but he never uttered a word of condemnation of rights violations in El Salvador, Colombia, Indonesia, or any other U.S. client states. He made communism a felony and barred communists and former communists from employment. Former aristocrats and their heirs were being given back all the lands their families had held before 1918 under the Austro-Hungarian Empire, disposing the previous occupants and sending many of them into destitution. Once the capitalist restorations in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union took state power, they worked hard to make sure that the new order of corporate plunder, individual greed, low wages, mindless pop culture, and limited electricity electoral democracy would take hold. They set about dismantling public ownership of production and the entire network of social programs that once served the public. They integrated the erstwhile communist countries into the global capitalist system by expropriating their land, labor, natural resources, and markets, swiftly transforming them into impoverished third world nations. All this was hailed in the US corporate-owned press as a great advance for humanity in the former communist nations. On page 100 he says, instead of mutual development, they were experiencing maldevelopment imposed by a global monopoly capital. Multinational corporations are moving into Russia to exploit vast oil and natural gas reserves and rich mineral deposits at great profit for themselves, with little benefit to the Russian people. In 1996, the IMF gave them a $10 billion loan, calling for privatization of agriculture and other state-owned assets, and the elimination of human and fuel subsidies. Hundreds of the more attractive and solvent state enterprises have been privatized, often given away at token prices to foreign investors, while other state firms are decapitated or driven into bankruptcy. As a side note, the privatization of oil and natural gas was reversed by Putin after he was elected in year 2000. Bulgaria was also suffering from a 20% monthly inflation and was sinking into that familiar cycle of foreign debt, cutting back on services to qualify for IMF loans, borrowing to pay off past borrowing. The government must impose more free market austerity measures to get vital international loans to repay portions of foreign debt. In West Germany, capitalists grabbed almost all the socialized property of the GDR, including factories, mills, farms, apartments and other real estate, and the medical care system. Assets worth about $2 trillion, in what has amounted to the largest expropriation of public wealth by private capital in European history. East Germans living in the West were staggered by the flood of complicated forms they had to fill out for taxes, health insurance, life insurance, unemployment compensation, job retraining, rent subsidies, and bank accounts. Furthermore, because of the kind of personal information they had to give, they felt more observed and spied on than they were under the Stasi, the GDR secret police. However, nothing compares to the NSA and the surveillance state of the United States. With luxury cars, increased costs of rent and real estate, stock exchanges, a new class of investors, speculators, and racketeers are wallowing in wealth. The professed goal is no longer to provide a better life for all citizens, but to maximize the opportunities for individuals to accumulate personal fortunes. On page 106, Parenti says, in Russia, the living standard of the average family has fallen almost by half. With the emerging free market, price deregulation produced not competitive prices, but prices set by private monopolies, adding to the galloping inflation. Beggars, pimps, dope pushers, and other hustlers ply their trades as never before, and there has been a dramatic rise in unemployment, homelessness, air and water pollution, prostitution, spousal abuse, child abuse, suicides, and just about every other social ill. In healthcare, the deterioration of immunization programs and health standards has allowed polio to make a serious comeback, along with tuberculosis, cholera, diphtheria, dysentery, and STDs. Drug addiction has sharply risen, not to mention rising infant mortality and soaring death rates. A staggering 1/3 of Russian men never lived to see 60 years of age. In 1992, Russia's birth rate fell below its death rate for the first time since World War II. East Germans buried 2 people for every baby born. In Mongolia, the communist era dramatically improved the quality of life of the people, achieving commendable levels of social development throughout state-sponsored social welfare measures. But free market privatization and deindustrialization has brought unemployment, mass poverty, and widespread malnutrition. The next section is titled Shock Therapy for the Many. Workers now toil harder and longer for less. With the rise in unemployment, decline in real income, consumer spending has decreased to 38% in 1992. At least 70% live below or just above the poverty line. Too weak to work, unpaid co-workers stop working, and power plants shut down, and thus causes energy crisis and electrical blackouts. Crime and corruption is also a problem. 50% of the oil shipped out of the country was stolen by either US Shell or British Petroleum. At the Russian Central Bank, $20 billion had been illegally taken out of the country and deposited into Western banks. In Moscow, it was estimated that corruption amounted to hundreds of billions of dollars. If these funds went into state coffers instead of private pockets, we could meet our budget 3 or 4 times over. There was also the emergence of the Russian mob. In 1994, there were more than 2,500 contract murders, almost all of them unsolved. In Hungary, thefts and felonies nearly tripled, and there has been a 50% increase in homicides. Cultural decay. The publicly owned movie industry, once thriving, had been defunded or taken over by corporate chains. Arts and literature had been defunded. Orchestras disbanded. During the communist era, 3 out of every 5 books in the world were produced in the Soviet Union. Today, readership has shrunk almost to third world levels. Education, once free, is now accessible only to those who can afford the costly tuition rates. In the curricula, perspectives critical of imperialism and capitalism have been replaced by supportive uncritical critical ones. A wave of spiritual groups, self-improvement gurus, and instant success peddlers descended upon Soviets. All media had been purged of leftists and restaffed by people with acceptable ideological orientations. Billboards and television commercials, once non-existent, now can be seen everywhere. The next section is Women and Children Last. The new constitution adopted in Russia eliminates provisions that guaranteed women their right to paid maternity leave, job security during pregnancy, prenatal care, and affordable daycare centers. The USSR offered 4 months off full pay for childbirth, partial pay if they chose to stay home, and allowed a 3-year leave that guaranteed their job when they returned. Working women decreased from 90% to 66%, and those who do work are being channeled into low-pay, unskilled positions. Many of those unemployed used to be skilled workers and professionals. In the region of Ingushetia, they decriminalized polygamy and made it legal for women to be sold into marriage. The Communist Party committees that used to intervene in cases of domestic abuse no longer exist. There's been a rise in sexual harassment, violence, murders, domestic abuse, a booming sex industry, including women and children. Free love is regarded as one of those new freedoms which the market economy can offer. The last section in this chapter is We Didn't Realize What We Had. Public opinion surveys show that many Russians consider Brezhnev's era and even Stalin's era to have been better than the present day period. The quality of life has deteriorated with the spread of crime and the disappearance of the social safety net. He quotes an East German woman who said, West Germany's women's movement was only beginning to fight for what we already had here. We took it for granted because of the socialist system. Now we realize what we lost. A Lutheran clergyman commented, We fell into the tyranny of money. We East Germans had no real picture of what life was like in the West. We had no idea. Unabashed greed and economic power are the levers that move this society. The spiritual values that are essential to human happiness are being lost or made to seem trivial. Everything is buy, earn, sell. Interviewing Russian workers, they've said, with capitalism, it's not life, it's just existence. Life was different 2 years ago. I was a human being. Now I chauffeur people around for extra money. How do you define freedom? Millions of people in Eastern Europe are now free from employment, free from safe streets, free from healthcare, free from social security. State socialism, the system that didn't work, provided everyone with some measure of security. Free market capitalism, the system that does work, brought a free-falling economy, financial plunder, deteriorating social conditions, and mass suffering. There were those on the left that said if the people in those countries discovered that they didn't like the free market system, that they could always return to some variant of socialism. Parenti thinks this is unrealistic. Capitalism is not just an economic system, but an entire social order. Once it takes hold, it is not voted out of existence by electing socialists or communists. They may occupy office, but the wealth of the nation, the basic property relations, organic law, the financial system, and the debt structure, along with the national media, police power, and state institutions, have all been fundamentally restructured. I would say, written in 1997, this is actually an outdated take by Parenti. 21st century socialism has brought a pink tide across Latin America, starting in 1999 in Venezuela with the election of Chavez, Brazil in 2002 with Lula, Bolivia in 2006 with Evo Morales, Nicaragua in 2007 with Sandinista leader Ortega, Honduras in 2009 with Zelaya, Mexico in 2018 with AMLO, and most recently this year in 2021 in Peru with Marxist Jose Pedro Castillo. He says on page 120, according to Noam Chomsky, communism was a monstrosity.
During the communist period, a monstrous period,
and the collapse of tyranny in Eastern Europe and Russia is an occasion for rejoicing for anyone who values freedom and human dignity. If anything, the breakup of the communist states has brought a colossal victory for global capitalism and imperialism, and with its correlative increase in human misery, it has been a historic setback for revolutionary liberation struggles everywhere. The breakup also means a net loss of global pluralism, giving rise to the unipolar era, which left the US as the sole superpower of the world.
We are the superstars, superstars are we, the ones who have the power. We are the superstars, superstars are we, the ones who have the power.
The overthrow of communism, however, does not mean the end of the US global military machine. Quite the contrary. The US quickly launched invasions in Panama, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and is providing military and financial support to the Saudis' war in Yemen and the Israeli genocide of the Palestinian people. During the Cold War, there were two poles, two superpowers. The justification for military intervention was communism. During the unipolar era, where the US was the sole superpower, the justification became terrorism. However, since the 2008 financial crisis, crisis, this has all changed, and we are now entering the age of multipolarity, and therefore the US is incapable of pushing around weaker nations as it once did. The people of Eastern Europe believe that they were going to keep all the social gains they had enjoyed under communism while adding all the consumerism of the West. Many of their grievances about existing socialism were justified, but their romanticized image of the capitalist West was not. They had to learn the hard way. Expecting to advance from second world to first world status, they have been rammed down into the third world. They wanted it all, but have been left with almost nothing. Chapter 8 is the end of Marxism? Marxism is superior to mainstream bourgeois science because it moves beyond surface appearances to see the deeper, broader, underlying forces of class power. Some people say that Marxism is a science. Others say it is utopian or dogmatic. Parenti suggests that Marxism is not a science in the positive sense, formulating hypotheses and testing for predictability, but more accurately a social science, one that shows us how to conceptualize systematically and systemically, moving from surface appearances to deeper, broader features, the infrared. So better to understand both the specific and the general, and the relationship between the two. Marxism has an explanatory power that is superior to mainstream bourgeois social science because it deals with the imperatives of class power and political economy, the motive force of society and history. The class basis of political economy is not a subject for which mainstream social science has much understanding or tolerance. In 1915, Lenin wrote that bourgeois science will not even hear of Marxism, declaring that it has been refuted and annihilated. Marx is attacked with equal zest by young scholars who are making a career by refuting socialism, and by decrepit elders who are preserving the tradition of all kinds of outworn systems. Over 80 years later, the career scholars are still demanding Marxism has been proven wrong once and for all. Now let's look at the basics. Was Marxism dogmatic? On page 122, he says, Marx's major work was Capital, a study not of existing socialism, which actually did not exist in his day, but of capitalism, a subject that remains terribly relevant to our lives. It would make more sense to declare Marxism obsolete if and when capitalism is abolished rather than socialism. On page 122 he says, Marxism isn't dead or obsolete. In fact, Marx is not only still relevant, but he is more relevant even today. The conflicting class interests that evolve around the productive forces shape the development of a social system. Capitalist theorists present capital as a creative force that gives shape and opportunity to labor. Capital creates production, jobs, new technologies, and a general prosperity. Marxists argue that of itself, capital cannot produce anything. It is the thing that is produced by our labor. Only human labor can create the farm and the factory, the machine and the computer. And in a class society, the wealth so produced by many is accumulated in the hands of the relatively few, who soon translate their economic power into political and cultural power in order to better secure the exploitative social order that so favors them. Trickle-down neoliberal economic theory says accumulation of wealth at the top eventually brings more prosperity to the rest of us below, a rising tide that lifts all boats. But we have yet to see the tide. In a class society, the accumulation of wealth fosters the spread of poverty. The wealthy few live off the backs of the impoverished many. During slavery, there could be no rich slaveholders living in idle comfort without a mass of penniless slaves to support their luxurious lifestyle. In feudalism, no lords of the manor could live in opulence without a mass of impoverished landless serfs who till the lord's land from dusk to dawn. So too under capitalism, there can be no financial moguls and industrial tycoons without millions of underpaid and overworked employees. Defenders of capitalism say that the system preserves traditional values and the family. Marxism would respond that capitalism has nothing more to undermine such things than any other system in history through wars, colonizations, forced migrations, its enclosures, evictions, poverty wages, child labor, homelessness, underemployment, crime, drug infestations, and urban squalor. This is what liberals forget. In the 1848 Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels predict the global tendency of capitalism to settle over the whole surface of the globe, creating a world after its own image. The most relentless destruction of cultures in an attempt to standardize the human experience to that of neoliberal global capitalism. The US has become a spiritual wasteland. Go to any town, you'll find a McDonald's, an IHOP, a Walmart. Suburbia is replicated across the entire country. Big capital has no commitment to anything but capital accumulation, no loyalty to any nation, culture, or people. The capitalist's goal is to make the largest possible profit off of other people's labor, accumulating capital at the highest possible rate without concern for human or environmental costs. Capitalism is a rational systemization of human endeavor in pursuit of a socially irrational end. In the next section, section, Parenti explains how Marx was more right than wrong. Marx accurately predicted business cycles and the tendency for economic recessions and crashes. Given the pressures of competition and rising wages, capitalists must make technological innovations to increase their productivity and diminish their labor costs. The more capital goods, such as machinery, plants, technologies, and fuels needed for production, the higher the fixed costs and the greater the pressure to increase productivity to maintain profits. Marx realized that in capitalism, workers are not paid enough to buy back the goods and services they produce. The ensuing drop in workers' buying power leads to a further decline in demand and to business recessions that inflict the greatest pain on those with the least assets. Marxists call this the crisis of overproduction, what bourgeois economists call business cycles or the boom and bust cycle. These crises hurt everyone, both the rich and the workers, but always hurt the workers the most. In Capital Volume 3, Marx foresaw this tendency for profits to fall and for protracted recessions and economic instability. This was an extraordinary prediction, for in Marx's day, economists did not recognize boom and bust business cycles as inherent to the capitalist system. Today, we know that recessions are a chronic condition of capitalism and have become international in scope. I recently finished a book written by Nelson Perry, The Future is Up to Us, where he explains how revolutions always come in three phases. Technological advances in the development of the means of production create the economic, material, and practical conditions for revolutions. First, there's an economic revolution, a technology. Second, a social revolution, which we're living through today. And third, a political revolution, the type of revolution we're most familiar with. Marx predicted the formation of monopolies, that large firms would force out or buy up smaller adversaries and increasingly dominate the business world as capital becomes more concentrated. Since 2008, we have seen massive corporate consolidation and mergers and acquisitions in almost every sector. Mass media now consists of 5 major conglomerates: Disney, CBS, NBC, and Warner Media. This was accelerated after Clinton's passage of the Telecommunications Act in 1996. I've also seen major consolidation within my industry of healthcare between pharmaceutical companies and health insurance companies. Marx predicted the growth of the proletariat and wage workers. In 1820, 75% of Americans worked for themselves on farms or in a small business in artisan crafts. By 1940, that number had dropped to 21%. And in 1997, less than 10% of the labor force is self-employed. Marx predicted the revolution would occur in the most industrialized capitalist countries. Instead, they happened in the most backwards of countries, including Russia and China. Lenin, in Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, articulates why this was not so. Contrary to his expectations, successful revolutions occurred in less developed, largely peasant societies such as Russia, China, Cuba, and Vietnam. As the working class developed, so did the capitalist state, whose function has been to protect the capitalist class, with its mechanisms of police suppression and its informational and cultural hegemony. Marx underestimated the extent to which the advanced capitalist state could use its wealth and power to create a variety of institutions that retard and distract popular consciousness or blunt discontent through reform programs and class concessions. Neoliberalism, with the restoration of class power, we saw the destruction of many of the progressive gains achieved by workers. Revolutions are rare, but popular struggle is a widespread and constant phenomenon. Popular struggle goes unreported in corporate media. We don't see the uprisings in Iraq or Colombia, or even the largest uprising in world history last year in India. The next section is More Wealth, More Poverty. Through persistent struggle, the working class improved its life conditions, with unions, the 8-hour workday, and a social safety net. This gave rise to the mid-20th century prosperous middle class, or labor aristocracy. However, neoliberalism has chipped away at all these gains. During the Reagan, Bush, Clinton era, and today extended by the Bush, Obama, Trump, Biden era, the share of the national income that went to those who work for a living shrank by over 12%. The share that went to those who live off investments increased almost 35%. In 1997, less than 1% of the populace owned almost 50% of the nation's wealth, a trend that's only continued. And statistics on this do not report above the reportable upper limit, therefore masking the true disparity between the rich and the poor. Today, regular employment is being replaced by contracted labor and temporary help, resulting in lower wages with fewer or no benefits, what we call the gig economy. Protective government regulations are being rolled back or left unenforced, and there has been an increase in speed-ups, injuries, and other workplace abuses. Free market reforms have brought a dramatic increase in poverty, hunger, crime, and ill health, along with the growth of large fortunes for the very few. especially in the third world global south. Clinton's NAFTA has devastated Mexico. Workers earned 50% less in 1995 than in 1980. It is deals like this which have created the conditions for the immigration crisis we face today. Marx predicted that an expanding capitalism would bring greater wealth for the few and growing misery for the many. That seems to be what is happening on a global scale. The next section is A Holistic Science, which covers dialectical materialism, the philosophy of Marxism. This was actually my favorite section of the book and what inspired me to do this book review. Liberal methodology and analysis treats the symptom without ever identifying the underlying disease. Liberals are undialectical and thus unscientific, stuck in an Anglo box which they superimpose upon the world around them. Focus on the particularities, they never consider the universal big picture. Their analysis falls short because they can only see individual disconnected events on the surface, not linked in any way to class or neoliberal global imperialism as the root of a deeper problem. Repeatedly dismissed as an obsolete doctrine, Marxism is less a body of fixed dicta and more a method or tool of looking beyond immediate surface appearances to the inner qualities and moving forces that shape society and history. Parenti quotes Das Kapital, Volume 3, page 956, where Marx says, "All of science would be superfluous if outward appearances and the essence of things directly coincided. Much of modern social science seems superfluous because it settles for the tedious tracing of outward surface appearances. This is positivism. To understand capitalism, one must first strip away the appearances presented by its ideology. Unlike bourgeois theorists, Marx realized what capitalism claims to be and what it actually is are two different things. The ultimate purpose of work is not to perform services for customers or sustain life in society, but to make more and more money for the investor, irrespective of the human and environmental costs." A key aspect of Marxist analysis is that ideology or the superstructure prefigures our behavior, how we think and act. Capitalism as the economic base moves into every area of work and community, harnessing all of social life in its pursuit of profit. We see the commodification of everything, converting nature, labor, science, art, music, and medicine into commodities, transforming land into real estate, folk culture into mass culture, and citizens into debt-ridden workers and consumers. Marxists understand that a class society is not just a divided society, but one ruled by class power, with the state playing the crucial role in maintaining an existing class structure. Again, Parenti says, capitalism is not just an economic system, but a political and cultural one as well, an entire social order. When Marxists study any part of that order, we will see how the particular reflects the nature of the whole. Mainstream media presents reality as a scatter of unrelated events, which fail to connect to the bigger picture. He asks us to consider racism. There's little analysis of what makes racism so functional for a class society. Instead, race and class are treated as mutually exclusive concepts in competition with each other. But those who have an understanding of class power know that as class contradictions deepen and come to the fore, racism becomes not less but more important as a factor in class conflict.
What am I getting arrested for? What am I getting arrested for? For being a mutt.
In short, both race and class are likely to be crucial arenas of struggle at the very same time. Today, the synthetic woke left and liberals use identity politics and critical race theory to distract the public away from a deeper materialist class analysis. Racism is used by both sides, often well-financed by reactionary forces seeking to divide the working populace against itself, fracturing it into antagonistic ethnic enclaves. It divides the working class and promotes the idea that races are inherently different. It's just another distraction from the bourgeoisie to keep the working class focused on other issues instead of class politics. Marxists also point out that racism is used as a means of depressing wages by keeping a segment of the labor force vulnerable to super exploitation. To see racism in the larger context of corporate society, it is a move from a liberal complaint to a radical analysis. Lacking a dialectical approach to society, liberal bourgeois theorists tend to compartmentalize social experience. So we are asked to ponder whether this or that phenomena is cultural or economic or psychological, when usually it is a blend of all of these. On page 134 he says, Marxists do not accept the prevalent view of institutions as completely benign, such as the church, army, police, military, university, media, or medicine. Institutions are ideological and serve a class function, what Althusser described as the ideological state apparatus and the repressive state apparatus. Institutions are heavily shaped by class interests and class power. Liberal thinkers avoid any point of view in its class dimensions, and any view of class as a power relationship. Postmodern thinkers see power as fragmented and fluid, and class is nothing more than an occupational or income category, not as a relationship between those who work for a living and those who live off the work of others. They concentrate on everything else but class, economics, or imperialism. Bourgeois scientists treat issues as isolated, with little thought about how issues link up to larger interests. Third world nations are described as dependent, rather than considering an imperialism that exploits the land, labor, and resources of weaker nations for the benefit of the favored classes in both the industrial and the less developed worlds. The mass propagation of conventional political beliefs through ideology isn't understood as indoctrination that distorts the information flow and warps the public's critical perceptions. The way ideology works is like mass conditioning. Americans passively absorb this information. It makes people believe certain things, but convince them that they came to their own conclusions. People believe that they are free thinkers, when really they are ideologically conditioned. What is overlooked in how we understand facts is how seemingly remote forces may prefigure our experiences. Next section is learning to ask why. When we use a liberal, classless analysis, we seldom ask why certain things happen. Little is said about how the social order is organized and whose interests prevail. Devoid of a framework or ideology that explains why things happen, we are left to see the world, as do mainstream media pundits, as a flow of events, a scatter of particular developments and personalities unrelated to a larger set of social relations. We fail to associate social problems with the socio-economic forces that created them, and we learn to truncate our own critical thinking. Parenti then has us do a thought experiment. Let's consider the child labor that's happening in Indonesia, say in a company like Nike. First, we may say child labor is contracted by multinationals at starvation wages. This might make it into the press because of its lack of class analysis or linkage to imperialism. But if we say the employer-employee relations are backed by the Indonesian military government, again, it might get published. No talk of class. But then if we say the government is propped up by US military aid, it becomes a little bit more controversial. Then what if we say this same setup exists in many countries around the world? Then what if we ask, why do US administrations constantly involve themselves in such unsavory pursuits around the world? And this is consistent with the US dedication to making the world safe for the free market and the giant multinational corporations, and that the goals are to maximize profit by decreasing wages and preventing them from organizing on behalf of their own interests, and to protect the overall global system of free market capital accumulation. And then, what if we conclude that US foreign policy is neither timid or foolish, but successful in rolling back just about all governments and social movements that attempt to serve popular needs rather than private corporate greed? Such an analysis of imperialism would never make it into the mainstream press, because we try to explain the particular situation, child labor, in terms of a larger set of social relations, corporate class power. Our presentation would be rejected as ideological. Marxism gets us into the habit of seeing the linkage between political events and class power. There is no shortage of intellectuals who seek to smear Marx. For example, Jordan B. Peterson, who I now think of as an intellectual fraud, doesn't know anything about Marxism, and thus misrepresents it.
Postmodern neo-Marxists. There's this unholy alliance between the postmodernists and the neo-Marxists.
Who are these postmodern egalitarian neo-Marxists?
This guy became famous by railing against postmodern neo-Marxists. He made his career by critiquing cultural Marxism. What he's actually critiquing is this synthetic, fake, woke left. If you're interested in a more advanced critique of the synthetic, woke, fake left, I recommend checking out Caleb Maupin's new book, Bread Tube Serves Imperialism. Capitalism and its various institutions affect the most personal dimensions of everyday life in ways not readily evident. A Marxist approach helps us to see the connections to which we were previously blind, to relate effects to causes, and to replace the arbitrary and the mysterious with the regular and the necessary, to view crucial developments not as neutral happenings, but as the intended consequences of class power and interests. Marxism is still relevant today. For all the misrepresentations and suppression, Marxist scholarship survives. While not having all the answers, it does have a superior explanatory power, telling us something about reality that bourgeois scholarship refuses to do. Marxism offers the kind of subversive truths that cause fear and trembling among the ruling class of international bankers and neoliberal globalists. The last chapter is anything but class, avoiding the C word. When certain words are eliminated from public discourse, so are certain thoughts. Dissident ideas become all the more difficult to express when there are no words to express them. The class denial of class. Contrary to popular belief, the ruling class has an acute awareness of their own class interests, and they discourage public awareness of the class power they wield. The dominant class ideology dismisses any such application as a lapse into conspiracy theory. We only hear of the middle class. We are told that they are virtually self-sufficient people, free from the wastefulness or laziness of those who inhabit the lower rungs of society, who need welfare, and who take our tax money. The middle class serves as a conveniently amorphous concept that masks the exploitation and inequality of social relations, and thus denies the actuality of class power. In reality, there is no middle class. They're actually just a segment of the working class. In the past, the labor aristocracy could have been considered the middle class. However, this section of society has been slowly stripped away by neoliberal austerity and global imperialism that has shut down factories and moved jobs overseas.
I already am eating from the trash can all the time. The name of this trash can is ideology.
Institutions are not free from ideology. Concentrations of wealth exercise an influence in all aspects of life. The people who make most of the decisions, the board of directors, are selected by corporate elites. They occupy positions in the state and policy making. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT, was a policy designed to circumvent whatever democratic sovereignty exists within nations. We're told that inequality and hierarchy is natural, that individual human behavior, not class, determines performance and life chances. If these elites are so capable, then why are they provided so many privileges, such as bank bailouts and subsidies at our expense? The anything but class theorists have a reluctance to deal with the reality of capitalist class power, and those who do are dismissed as orthodox Marxists, class reductionists, or conspiracy theorists. Today, many left academics and postmodernists are working in cultural studies. One of the main effects of cultural studies is to draw attention away from the vital realities of class power. Parenti calls out the synthetic woke left. Many who pretend to be on the left are so rabidly anti-Marxist as to seize upon any conceivable notion except class power to explain what is happening in the world. They focus on identity politics and critical race theory. They are functionally indistinguishable from liberals in their anti-Marxism and ability to stunt class consciousness. One recent fad of the left woke intellectuals is postmodernism, which argues that the principles of rationality and evidence of modern times no longer apply. Long-standing ideologies have lost their relevance, as has most of political economy and history. They reject meta-narratives and reject ideology. In their endless search for conceptual schema that might mute Marxist class analysis, the synthetic left have twaddled for years over false economization between early Marx and later Marx. Early Marx, or the good Marx, is culturalistic, humanistic. They overemphasize Marx's concept of alienation found in the economic manuscripts of 1844. In contrast, the late or bad Marx is characterized as dogmatic or economistic. They point to books like Das Kapital, The 18th Vermeer, and Critique of the Gotha Program, which emphasize the need for a strong state and the dictatorship of the proletariat. However, this dichotomization between early and late Marx is a myth. In Marx's earlier works, he leaned more heavily on philosophy and criticisms of the neo-Hegelians. And in fact, dialectics and alienation appear throughout his work, including Capital. This artificial counterposing transforms a relatively minor development in Marx's work into a chasm between two ways of thinking that have little in common. Academics have created a mythical Gramsci who rejects the economistic views of Marx and Lenin and did not treat class conflict as a central concept based on his analysis of cultural hegemony. Gramsci has become palatable to liberals, safe, tamed, denatured, a wisp of his revolutionary self. He never treated culture and class as mutually exclusive terms, but saw cultural hegemony as a vital instrument of the ruling class. Gramsci held a prominent position in the Italian Communist Party and considered himself firmly within the Marxist-Leninist camp. Academics reduce class to a mere demographic or occupational trait with little significance. Class is not a taboo subject if divorced from capitalism's exploitative accumulation process. The synthetic left and liberals fail to consider the dynamic interrelationship that gives classes their significance. In contrast, Marxists see that the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. Class is an exploitative relationship, a constant transfer of wealth from those who work to those who own. This is how some people get richer and richer without working, while others toil for an entire lifetime, only to end up with little or nothing. For example, my mom. She's worked in the same job for over 30 years now. She can't afford a day off and never takes a vacation. And my generation of millennials, we were born into this neoliberal age of austerity. Most of us will never own a house, and many are stuck living at home in their parents' basement. As Marxist-Leninists, we're called class reductionists. But what is more reductionist than giving attention to every social group in capitalist society except the capitalist class itself, to every social conflict except class conflict? Some modern theorists talk about the professional managerial class, or PMCs. It's referenced as a class unto themselves, but they are not. They are mental workers who do live much better than most other employees, but who still serve the accumulation process on behalf of corporate owners. Academics repeatedly assert that there is not going to be a workers' revolution in the United States in the foreseeable future. They say that the working class is incapable of revolution.
So the kind of fantasy socialists or communists and so on might have had, which is that we can destroy this capitalist system and we can build something entirely different, that is an impossibility right now. A revolutionary overthrow of this capitalist economic system is not anything that's conceivable at the present time. It will not happen, and it cannot happen, and we have to make sure that it does not happen.
Some even go as far as to make it all about race and say that the white working class has no revolutionary potential. Left intellectuals deem class struggle to be irrelevant, and anyone who thinks otherwise is a class reductionist. Meanwhile, you don't have to look far to realize that class power is becoming increasingly transparent. Corporate concentration and profit accumulation are higher than ever. The tax system has become more regressive and oppressive. There is an acceleration of upward transfer of wealth, privatization of the public sector. People at home and abroad are working harder for less. Corporate money is increasingly controlling the political process. Dark money, PACs, super PACs. Consider again that this book was written in 1997. These issues are only more relevant today. And poverty is growing faster than the overall population. There are mainstream right-wingers who maintain a better awareness of class struggle than the synthetic left.
The left is now telling you and demanding that you believe that anyone who supports Donald Trump is a white supremacist and must be destroyed. This is not a white supremacist country plotting the slaughter of its own people. Ever wonder why rich people seem the most hysterical on the subject? Ever notice that it's the highest paid people on television who are the most determined to convince you that white supremacy is America's biggest problem? Why is that? Simple. Every minute you're angry about race is a minute you're not thinking about class, which of course is the real divide in this country. Working class people of all colors have a lot more in common, infinitely more in common with each other than they do with some overpaid MSNBC anchor. And if you were allowed to think about that for long enough, you might start to get unauthorized ideas about economics. And that would be disruptive to a very lucrative status quo. So they whip you into a frenzy of racial fear so that it never enters your mind. It's a diversion. Everyone else hates each other. They get to keep their money. People know their country is in decline.
Seizing upon anything but class, U.S. leftists today have developed an array of identity groups centering around ethnic, gender, cultural, and lifestyle issues. These groups treat their respective grievances as something apart from class struggle. Identity groups tend to emphasize their distinctiveness and their separateness from each other, thus fractionalizing the protest movement. To be sure, they do have important contributions to make, but they also should not downplay their common interests, nor overlook the common class enemy we face. The forces that impose class injustice and economic exploitation are the same ones that propagate racism, sexism, militarism, ecological devastation, homophobia, xenophobia, and the like. These factors operate within an overall class society. Racism and sexism help to create super-exploited categories of workers, minorities, and women, and reinforce the notions of inequality that are so functional for capitalist society. To embrace a class analysis is not to deny the significance of identity issues, but to see how these are linked both to each other and to the overall structure of political economic power.
I want to thank every Amazon employee and every Amazon customer, because you guys paid for all of this.
The complaint is not that the rich have so much more than everyone else, but that their superabundance and endless accumulation comes at the expense of everyone and everything else. Great concentrations of wealth give the owning class control not only over the livelihoods of millions, but over civic life itself. Immense political influence, their monopoly ownership of mass media, their access to skilled lobbyists in high public office. To those who possess it, great wealth brings social prestige and cultural dominance, including membership of governing boards of foundations, universities, museums, research institutions, and professional schools.
We came
We saw, he died.
History offers numerous examples of leaders who, in the name of national security, have been ready to extinguish what precious few liberties people might have won. Challenges to the privileged social order are treated as attacks upon all social order. The elites want a strong state with a weak government. Once in control of the state, plutocratic interests can use their regressive taxation system to make the public pay for the agencies of oppression that are essential to elite domination. Still, democratic governance can prove troublesome, inciting all sorts of popular demands and imposing restraints on big businesses' enjoyment of a freewheeling market. Therefore, capitalists support both a strong state armed with every intrusive power and a weak government unable to stop corporate abuse or serve the needs of ordinary people. That's why we have a two-party system that gets nothing done. Both the United States and China have a strong state, but where they differ is their government. The US has a weak government while China has a strong government with a one-party rule able to represent and serve the people. Capitalism is a rational system with its systematic maximization of power and profits, but with an ultimately irrational consequence of devouring the system itself and everything else with it. Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, is a paper tiger and is falling apart around us. Today, America is a lot like ancient Rome. It's obvious that we're living in an empire in decay. The last section of the book is titled Eco-Apocalypse, a Class Act. With its never-ending emphasis on exploitation and expansion, and its indifference to environmental costs, capitalism appears determined to stand outside nature. It treats the planet's life-sustaining resources, arable land, groundwater, wetlands, forests, fisheries, ocean beds, rivers, air quality, as dispensable ingredients of limitless supply to be consumed or toxified at will. Global warming or climate change, as we know, is caused by greenhouse gases, primarily by combustion of fossil fuels derived from oil. Malthusians on the left and right blame overpopulation, reaching the ultimate conclusion that they must advocate for some form of population control or eugenics. Global elites, in their attempts to sustain the global neoliberal capitalist system, advocate for a Green New Deal, which has already been earmarked and co-opted to give handouts to big businesses. US politicians constantly try to shift blame onto the individual. They propagate the myth that the ecological crisis we face is a matter of irrational individual behavior rather than being of a social magnitude. In truth, the problem is not individual choice, but the system that imposes itself on individuals and prefigures their choice. One might ask, why is the rich destroying the planet, something that we all share equally? Well, they actually do not live as everyone else. Society is increasingly becoming stratified into a two-track system. The rich live in places with clean air and water, eat organic foods, and don't live near highways or toxic dumps. The working poor is more likely to live in areas with polluted air, live on processed foods, and in Flint, Michigan, they still have lead in the water. There's a quote by Lenin where he says, "The workers earn so little that they have to buy cheap, low-grade, substitute food products. And yet, the workers are the chief customers. There are millions of workers and only hundreds of capitalists. And so, the output of cheap substitutes is growing daily and hourly, along with the unheard of luxury of a handful of millionaires. As capitalists, they do not live in the long run, but in the here and now, where short-term profits and re-elections rule. Businesses' budget impact models only look out about 5 years on average. In contrast, China is able to set a 50-year plan to eliminate poverty, which they achieved in 2020 during the COVID pandemic, and they are currently on course to achieve their 100-year plan of complete modernization. This is a superior economic political system, able to plan for the long term and create the material abundance required to achieve the higher phase of communism. For capitalists, every dollar spent on environmental protections is one less dollar of earnings. Oil provides billions in profits to some of the largest corporations of the world. Green energy and ecologically sustainable forms of production threaten their profits. Unfortunately, today, we have no choice but to use cars and iPhones for transportation and communications, even though we know they're bad. Ecology is profoundly subversive to capitalism. It needs planned, economically sustainable production. The real solution to this problem is nuclear fusion.